Number 7. Leaning on community support. Did you know that medieval women often had no one but each other? In the harsh world of medieval Europe, where life expectancy rarely exceeded 40 years and childbirth claimed countless lives, women relied heavily on their communities to survive tragedy. Village life in medieval times centered around tight-knit communities where everyone knew everyone else's business. This might sound intrusive to our modern sensibilities, but for medieval women, this interconnectedness provided an essential support system during times of hardship. When a woman lost her husband, children, or faced other tragedies, the community often rallied around her. In 12th century English villages, records show that widows frequently received food contributions from neighbors while they adjusted to their new circumstances. Court rolls from the period mention cases where communities collectively petitioned lords to reduce the obligations of women who had suffered significant losses. Archaeological evidence from burial sites across Europe reveals communal grieving practices, with personal tokens from multiple households found in graves of women and children. The church parish served as another crucial community hub. Women gathered not just for worship, but for mutual aid. Parish guilds, often with women's sections, collected funds to support members during difficult times. A surviving guild roll from 14th century Norwich shows that when Agnes Miller lost her husband and 2 children to plague, the Women's Guild provided her with bread and ale for 3 months while she recovered from her grief. Urban areas had their own support networks. Guild records from medieval London show that craftsmen's widows were often allowed to continue their late husband's trades, sometimes with assistance from other guild members. The Silkworkers Guild of Paris maintained detailed records of providing financial support to women who had lost their primary breadwinners. A particularly touching practice emerged in some communities where women who had experienced similar losses formed informal support groups. Historical records from 15th century Florence mention widow circles where women who had lost husbands would gather regularly to share meals and provide emotional support. Similar arrangements existed for mothers who had lost children. These community connections weren't just emotional. They were practical survival mechanisms. In a world without social security, insurance, or public assistance, the community stepped in to fill these gaps. Women who had weathered their own tragedies often became sources of strength and wisdom for others, experiencing similar hardships. Creating a cycle of mutual support that helped entire communities endure. Number 6. Finding solace in religion and ritual. Have you ever wondered how women found meaning in a world filled with constant death and suffering? For medieval women, religion wasn't just a Sunday obligation. It was the primary framework through which they understood life, death, and everything that happened in between. The medieval period was saturated with religious belief. Christianity dominated Western European life, influencing everything from daily routines to major life decisions. When tragedy struck, women turned to prayer, religious rituals, and the church community for comfort and explanation. Prayer books specifically designed for women from this period reveal incredibly personal supplications. The 15th century Book of Hours, belonging to Catherine of Cleves, contains moving prayers asking for strength during bereavement. These books weren't merely religious texts. They were intimate companions for women navigating personal tragedy. Archaeologists have found prayer beads buried with women across Europe, often worn down from years of handling. Physical evidence of daily spiritual practice. Religious rituals provided structure during chaotic emotional times. The church offered specific prayers and ceremonies for virtually every type of loss. When a child died, mothers participated in purification rituals that acknowledged both the physical and emotional aftermath of such losses. Documents from church archives show that women often donated modest sums for perpetual prayers to be said for deceased loved ones, regardless of their economic status, suggesting the importance of maintaining a spiritual connection with those they had lost. Pilgrimages became important coping mechanisms for grieving women. Historical records document women traveling considerable distances to holy sites after experiencing significant losses. The shrine of Saint Etheldreda in Ely was particularly popular among women who had lost children, while widows often made pilgrimages to St. James's Shrine in Compostela. These journeys served multiple purposes. They provided a physical action to channel grief, created a supportive community of fellow pilgrims, and offered hope for divine intervention or comfort. For some women, religious devotion became their primary identity after loss. The number of women entering convents increased significantly following the Black Death, with many citing personal losses as their motivation. Abbess Elizabeth of Schonau's writings from the 12th century describe how many of her nuns had joined the convent after losing husbands and children, finding in religious life a new purpose and community. Even women who couldn't join convents found ways to incorporate religious devotion into their response to tragedy. Beguines, lay religious women who lived in semi-monastic communities without taking formal vows, emerged particularly in the Low Countries, providing a middle path between secular and religious life for women seeking spiritual purpose after personal loss. Church records from across medieval Europe contain countless examples of women who, after losing husbands or children, dedicated themselves to charitable works. Matilda of Scotland, after several personal tragedies, including miscarriages and the deaths of close family members, founded hospitals and worked directly with the sick and poor as an expression of her grief and faith. Number 5. Embracing practical resilience through work. Ever noticed how keeping busy helps during difficult times? Medieval women knew this instinctively, and their response to tragedy often involved throwing themselves into necessary work, both for survival and for emotional regulation. Life in medieval times demanded constant labor from everyone, regardless of social status. For women experiencing loss or hardship, work wasn't just economically necessary. It provided structure, purpose, and distraction during overwhelming emotional periods. Court records and manorial rolls reveal that widows often took over their husbands' trades or agricultural responsibilities immediately following bereavement. A fascinating study of guild records from 14th century London shows that within weeks of losing husbands, many women were petitioning for the right to continue their spouses' businesses. These weren't just acts of economic necessity. They represent a practical approach to grief that emphasized continuity and purpose. For rural women, agricultural cycles didn't pause for personal tragedy. Records from manorial courts show women returning to fieldwork shortly after burying family members. The harvest had to be brought in, animals needed tending, and daily survival required ongoing labor. Archaeological evidence from medieval households shows that women's work areas, looms, kitchen hearths, dairy processing spaces, show continuous use even during periods when we know from other records that the household experienced significant losses. Textile production offered many women both livelihood and emotional regulation during difficult times. The repetitive nature of spinning, weaving, and embroidery provided a meditative quality that women themselves recognized as therapeutic. A remarkable letter from a 15th century Flemish widow to her sister describes how the rhythm of the loom soothes my troubled heart when nothing else brings peace. For women of higher social status, managing estates and households provided similar structure. When Lady Margaret Paston lost family members during the tumultuous Wars of the Roses, her letters show her immersing herself in estate management, making detailed decisions about agriculture, legal matters, and household affairs. These activities weren't just necessary. They provided continuity and purpose during chaotic emotional times. Child-rearing responsibilities also continued regardless of other losses. Archaeological evidence shows that children's items like toys and clothing continued to be made and maintained even in households experiencing significant hardship, suggesting that caring for surviving children provided both purpose and comfort for grieving mothers. Even artistic production could serve this purpose. Surviving embroidery, illuminated manuscripts, and other handicrafts created by women during periods of known personal hardship demonstrate how creative work provided both emotional outlet and practical purpose. Historical records mention an English noblewoman who, after losing her husband and 2 children in quick succession, produced an extraordinary amount of embroidery for her parish church work that served both as memorial and as therapeutic activity. For many women, particularly those in lower social classes, the luxury of extended grieving simply wasn't possible. Economic survival demanded continued productivity, yet this necessity may have provided an unexpected benefit, giving structure and purpose during emotionally chaotic times. The material record of medieval women's lives, the objects they made, the spaces they maintained, the work they completed, shows remarkable continuity even through periods of documented personal tragedy. Number 4. Preserving memory through material culture. What would you save if you lost someone you loved? Medieval women created and treasured objects that helped them remember their loved ones, developing sophisticated material practices that preserved connections with those they had lost. In a world before photography, maintaining memory required creativity and intentionality. Archaeological evidence reveals that medieval women developed numerous strategies to maintain connections with deceased loved ones through physical objects and customs. Clothing played a particularly important role in memory preservation. Excavations of medieval graves have revealed that women often kept garments belonging to deceased family members, sometimes repurposing them into memory objects. A child's tunic might be transformed into a cushion cover. A husband's cloak might be remade into a wall hanger. These transformations served practical purposes while maintaining tangible connections to the deceased. Jewelry and personal accessories served similar functions. Archaeological discoveries from across Europe show that bereavement rings containing hair or tiny portraits of the deceased were common among women who could afford them. More humble examples include simple finger rings made from the buttons of a deceased husband's clothing, or pendants containing scraps of fabric from a child's garment. Women's wills from the period reveal the emotional significance of these memory objects. A surviving 15th century will from a London widow specifically bequeaths the small silver brooch made from my daughter Mary's baptismal spoon to her niece, with instructions to remember the child it commemorated. Such bequests appear frequently in medieval women's testaments, creating chains of memory that extended beyond individual grieving. Home spaces became repositories of memory as well. Archaeological investigations of medieval dwellings have uncovered hidden caches of personal items associated with deceased family members. A child's shoe concealed in a wall, a man's tools purposefully placed beneath floorboards. Far from random, these placements represent intentional memory practices, creating physical anchors for emotional connections that women wanted to preserve. Written memorials emerged as literacy increased, particularly in the later medieval period. Women who could write often kept obituary books, recording the names and death dates of family members, while those who couldn't write commissioned such records from local clerics. A remarkable example survives from a 14th century French merchant's widow who maintained a family memorial book for over 30 years, recording not just dates but personal details about those she had lost. Commemoration through charity became another important memory practice. Records from hospitals and almshouses across Europe contain countless examples of women establishing small charitable foundations in memory of deceased family members. These commemorations often specified practical items connected to the deceased: bread distributions on the anniversary of a baker's death, or cloth gifts remembering a weaver. Even everyday household objects could become vehicles for memory. Archaeological finds include cooking vessels with names scratched into them, spindle whorls marked with personal symbols, and household tools decorated in ways that suggest commemorative intent. These objects allowed women to incorporate memory into daily activities, maintaining connections while continuing necessary work. For women who lost children, memory preservation took particular forms. Excavations of medieval homes have uncovered carefully preserved children's toys, sometimes found in spaces associated with women's work, suggesting they were kept close as memory objects. Church records mention women donating their deceased children's clothing to be used for altar cloths or saints' statues, transforming personal tragedy into sacred memory. Number 3. Seeking practical health solutions. How did women manage their physical and mental health during times of extreme stress? Medieval women weren't just passive victims of circumstance. They actively sought healing through a sophisticated blend of empirical knowledge, folk practices, and available medical resources. The medieval medical landscape offered women multiple healing traditions they could draw upon during times of hardship. While formally trained physicians were primarily men, women operated as primary healthcare providers in most households and communities, developing and sharing practical medical knowledge that helped them navigate both physical and emotional dimensions. Herbal medicine formed the cornerstone of women's healing practices. Archaeological analysis of medieval gardens and households reveals consistent cultivation of medicinal plants known to address both physical ailments and emotional states. Herbs like valerian and chamomile, which modern science confirms have mild sedative properties, appear regularly in women's garden spaces, suggesting their use for anxiety and insomnia that commonly accompany grief. Surviving household manuscripts contain recipes for heart ease, tonics, and grief teas that combined such plants with specific preparation instructions. The 13th century Physicians of Maidekai collection, compiled in Wales, includes several formulations specifically noted as helpful for women experiencing emotional distress after losses, combining herbal ingredients with practical administration. Advice. Women also develop sophisticated understanding of the connection between physical and emotional health. Court records occasionally mention women seeking exemptions from certain obligations due to what we might now recognize as depression following significant losses. A 1342 petition from a guildswoman in York describes being too heavy of heart to work following her children's deaths from plague, requesting temporary relief from guild obligations, which was granted, with the recommendation of specific foods and activities to lighten the spirits. Sleep aids appear frequently in women's medical collections, reflecting awareness that sleep disruption accompanies grief. A household book from 15th century Germany includes detailed instructions for creating sleep-inducing pillows filled with specific herbs, particularly recommended for women troubled by sorrowful thoughts in the night hours. Archaeological evidence confirms these practices, with traces of such herbs found in textile fragments from women's household spaces. For physical manifestations of emotional distress, women developed practical interventions. Headache remedies, digestive aids, and treatments for what we might now call stress-related conditions appear consistently in women's medical writings. The Trocula, a collection of medical works associated with women healers from Salerno, includes treatments for physical symptoms explicitly connected to emotional states, including grief. Women also recognized the importance of what we might now call mental health interventions. A remarkable letter from a 14th century abbess to a recently widowed noblewoman recommends speaking of your grief to trusted women who have known similar sorrows, and permitting yourself daily tears but also daily moments of distraction through useful work, advice that parallels modern grief counseling approaches. Communal healing practices emerged particularly around childbirth losses, which affected most medieval women at some point. Archaeological and textual evidence reveals ceremonies conducted by women for women who had experienced miscarriages or infant deaths, combining practical physical care with emotional and spiritual support. Excavations at some medieval sites have uncovered special vessels and implements associated specifically with these women-centered healing rituals. While modern medicine might dismiss many medieval remedies as placebo effects, contemporary research on grief and trauma suggests that the holistic approaches women developed, combining herbal treatments, social support, spiritual practices, and practical activity. Number 2. Remaking identity through life transitions. Who would you become if everything changed overnight? For medieval women, significant losses often necessitated complete identity transformations, requiring remarkable flexibility and reinvention. Identity in medieval society was largely determined by relationships and roles: daughter, wife, mother, widow, with each bringing specific social expectations and practical realities. When death or other hardships disrupted these roles, women faced the challenge of reconstructing their identities within a highly structured social system. Widowhood represented one of the most significant identity transitions many women experienced. Historical records demonstrate that medieval widows developed varied strategies for navigating this identity shift. Some women embraced the relative independence widowhood could offer. Legal records from towns across Europe show widows establishing independent households, managing businesses, and participating in economic activities often restricted to men. The widow's portion, guaranteed by many medieval legal codes, provided some women with their first experience of financial independence. Court records from 14th century London show women like Marjorie Kempe transforming from wife to independent businesswoman following her husband's death, establishing brewing operations and other commercial ventures. Other women chose remarriage as their strategy for identity reconstruction. Parish records indicate that widows with young children often remarried within a year of losing a husband, a timeline that modern sensibilities might consider rushed, but that represented practical necessity in an era when two-parent households were often essential for economic survival. Marriage contracts for second marriages reveal that widows often entered these arrangements with greater negotiating power than first-time brides, specifying conditions to protect their children's interests and maintaining control of property from their first marriages. For women who lost children, identity reconstruction took different forms. Archaeological evidence of medieval households suggests that women who lost children often took in orphaned relatives or neighbor children. Parish records document formal adoption arrangements, becoming more common after periods of high child mortality, such as plague outbreaks. These practices allowed women to maintain mothering identities even after losing biological children. Some women chose spiritual reinvention following significant losses. The dramatic increase in women seeking religious vocations after the Black Death wasn't merely coincidental. Many explicitly cited personal losses as motivation for religious turns. Julian of Norwich, whose writings remain influential today, entered her anchor-hold after experiencing the plague and likely losing family members. Her subsequent mystical experiences and writings emerged directly from this context of personal and community loss. Even for women who didn't enter formal religious life, charitable work offered a path for identity reconstruction. Records from hospitals and almshouses show women becoming increasingly involved in charitable activities following personal losses. This pattern crossed social classes. Noble women founded institutions, while women of more humble means contributed time and modest resources to existing charities. For women who faced economic hardship rather than bereavement, migration became an important strategy for identity reconstruction. Urban records show increasing numbers of women moving from rural areas to cities following crop failures or after losing access to land. These geographical moves facilitated identity transitions, allowing women to establish themselves in new contexts, with new social and economic roles. What's remarkable in the historical record is how many medieval women successfully navigated these forced identity transitions. Despite a society that defined women primarily through their relationships to others, they demonstrated remarkable adaptability when those relationships were severed by death or altered by circumstance. Number 1. Navigating emotional recovery through creative expression. Can creativity heal a broken heart? Medieval women left behind compelling evidence that creative expression played a crucial role in processing grief and hardship, developing sophisticated artistic responses to personal tragedy. Although most formally recognized medieval art was produced by men, women created significant bodies of work that served both practical and emotional purposes. Much of this creative production intensified during periods of personal hardship, suggesting its therapeutic function. Textile arts provided a particularly important creative outlet. Embroidery, weaving, and textile decoration were socially approved activities for women across most social classes. Analysis of surviving medieval textiles reveals fascinating patterns of emotional expression. A remarkable embroidered altar cloth, created by an English noblewoman following the deaths of her children, incorporates subtle memorial elements, flowers associated with the children's name, saints, birds that held symbolic meaning for the family creating a permanent memorial disguised, illuminated manuscripts created by women, particularly from convents, sometimes contain visual elements scholars have identified as responses to community losses. A 14th-century psalter created at the Rhenish Abbey of Arnstein shows distinctive memento mori imagery that intensified following a documented period of high mortality in the community. The illustrations become more elaborate, specifically on psalms associated with grief and consolation, suggesting their creation served therapeutic purposes for the women producing them. Music provided another creative channel for emotional processing. While formal composition was largely male-dominated, women's participation in musical performance is well documented. Convent records describe special musical compositions performed by women on the anniversaries of community members' deaths. Even in secular contexts, women's song was associated with emotional expression, with several surviving lyrics addressing themes of loss and resilience. Storytelling traditions offered verbal creative outlets. While written literature was accessible primarily to elite women, oral storytelling traditions crossed social boundaries. Folklorists have identified consistent patterns in stories, traditionally associated with women tellers, with themes of endurance through suffering, transformation after loss, and restoration following hardship, appearing with remarkable consistency across different European regions. Even domestic arts could become vehicles for emotional expression. Archaeological analysis of medieval cookery shows interesting patterns emerging during times of community hardship. The increased production of certain traditional foods associated with commemoration suggests cooking itself could become a creative response to loss. A surviving 15th-century household book from Italy includes recipes specifically noted as comforts for the grieving, suggesting the deliberate use of food preparation as emotional care. For women in religious communities, mystical writing often emerged from contexts of personal or community suffering. The extraordinary visionary texts of Hildegard of Bingen, Elizabeth of Schonau, and Hadouage developed during periods when their communities faced significant hardships. These works transform personal and collective suffering into creative theological exploration, offering paths for understanding pain within larger spiritual frameworks. Letter writing provided another creative outlet, particularly for literate women. Surviving correspondence between medieval women reveals sophisticated emotional support networks where difficult feelings could be expressed and processed. The remarkable letters between the noblewoman Marguerite de Carouge and her female friends following personal tragedies show how written expression helped articulate and eventually transform grief through shared reflection. Perhaps most striking is how often creative expression connected grieving women across time. Many of these creative works explicitly address future women who might experience similar losses. A surviving embroidery pattern book from 15th century Germany includes designs specifically intended for grieving women to create, with accompanying text noting that the work would connect the maker with all women before and after who have carried such sorrows. Do these ancient creative responses to hardship still have something to teach us about resilience? The material evidence of medieval women's creative lives reveals sophisticated understanding of how making things, whether textiles, food, music, or stories, helps remake the self after loss. Their creative strategies weren't just personal therapy, but contributed to community healing and constructed frameworks for understanding suffering that extended beyond individual experience.